My first true crime novel was published in early 2011. The book followed the 4-year career of a serial killer in southern Illinois, covering the grisly details of his murders and eventually ending with his arrest. The book was absolutely perfect. I poured hundreds of hours into research, interviews, and writing. I was convinced that it was a sure ticket into a life as a famous author. My publisher had other plans. They claimed that money was far too tight and that they had to cancel my marketing campaign. It was just a coincidence that they abandoned me just as they pushed hundreds of thousands of dollars resources towards another author. So of course, my novel failed. Of course, no one bought it. And if there's one thing publishers avoid more than unpublished amateurs, it's authors with a single failed book. I've spent the last few years trying to cobble something together that might convince them to give me another chance. When I heard about a string of murders in my town, it seemed the perfect opportunity for a comeback. I poured myself another glass of whiskey by the light of my computer monitor. My ice cube had melted 3 glasses back, but no matter. I couldn't slow my research into the killer's background, his victims, his method of murder, all of it. I took a sip as I reread another police report. The killer had used a fire axe to commit the crimes. Very gory. That was good. Gory murders always sell better than boring firearm-related crimes. Even better was the fact that he'd killed families instead of single people. That was yet another angle I could exploit. I clicked on a news clip from the night he'd been arrested. The best part of this case was the fact that the lunatic had turned himself in. I drained the rest of my glass, already planning what I write about that. Family serial killer with a conscience? I made a list of names to contact the next day. The police raid on the killer's apartment had been highly publicized, so I knew exactly where he lived. I looked up the landlord who owned the apartment complex and wrote his number down on a little notebook I carry around with me. A few well-placed lies might get me a tour of the killer's private quarters. I woke up the next morning with a splitting headache and nausea. But I didn't let that slow me down. I rolled over, took a shower, and went out to meet with the landlord of the apartment. He was a tall, portly man in his late 40s. He seemed friendly and more than a little stupid. He unlocked the door for me and showed me a few of the rooms. The apartment had been almost completely cleared out by someone. I guess first the police and then the movers. I nodded along as the landlord continued the tour of the apartment, showing me the kitchen, then the master bedroom. I knew the killer had a habit of hiding bodies inside crawl spaces from my research, and was on the lookout for them. I noticed a vent in the corner of the master bedroom that looked to be pressure fit into the wall. Seems like a great place, just the kind of thing I've been looking for, I said, wiping away the post-drinking sweats that were growing on my forehead. You mind if I use the bathroom before we finish here? The landlord pointed to the master bathroom. Be my guest. I purposefully spent a long time in there, hoping he'd leave the bedroom. I was rewarded when he called out, "I'll be by my car downstairs when you're finished." I left the bathroom and crept up to the vent. I pulled hard on the metal and was rewarded as it slid smoothly from the wall. Inside was a space about 2 feet wide and 1 foot tall. It extended back into the darkness for several feet at least. And there, lying in the dust on the metal floor, was a leather-bound notebook. I snatched it from the ground, hardly believing my luck. It was thick and well used, but I stuffed it inside my shirt for the time being. Replacing the metal grate was harder than pulling it off, but I managed it without making too much noise. I returned to the landlord outside, turning to look up at the small apartment. "I'm gonna be honest with you," I said. "How's that?" he asked, confused. "I'm Jim Sullivan, a true crime novelist," I said. "I'm here to find out if there's anything interesting left about your most recently departed tenant." The landlord's face clouded over with anger. "So this was a waste of my time then? I was wondering if you had any information about not for liars. Get off my property. I never want to see you here again." I thanked him and returned to my car, my mind already on nothing but the thick leather booklet inside my shirt. I rushed home, guarding the notebook like a goose with a golden egg. I prepared my desk with a spiral notebook and a blue pen ready by my right hand. Then, trembling, I opened the notebook. It was far better, and far worse, than I could have ever imagined. The killer had written his planning of the murders in excruciating detail. He explained how he watched the houses, how he waited to see whether or not the husbands loved their wives, whether or not the children were disobedient, what kind of dinners they ate, and at what time. He must have stalked them for days beforehand. But the details in the planning were nothing to the details in describing the murders themselves. I had to pause halfway through reading one account. He kept describing the look on the father's face as his wife died. I poured myself a tall drink, drained it, then poured myself another. The killer languished in the description of their cries, their last dying moments, their pitiful supplication for mercy. I finished the bottle before I finished the notebook. After his account of the fourth family murder, the pages of the book finally, mercifully, went blank. When he finished describing the desecration of the last corpse, I closed the book with trembling fingers. My head throbbed with alcohol and the horrible images racing through my mind, but I couldn't help but hold my hands to my mouth in joy. What a find! What a treasure trove of information! 100 years of interviews couldn't give me what this one book had just dropped into my lap. I was going to be famous again! I laughed out loud into the empty room, picked up the already empty bottle of whiskey to my lips, and licked at the last drop before walking to my bedroom. I woke up late the next afternoon feeling woozy. I felt something worse than a hangover. Must have drunk more than I'd been planning to. But could anyone really blame me, reading those horrible things I'd read? No, of course, no one could blame me. In fact, no one could blame me if I had another drink right now to ease this horrible throbbing in my skull. I got to my feet and walked to the kitchen. I cracked open a beer before walking back to my desk. The notebook caught my eyes as I passed. It was different, somehow thicker. I picked it up and realized that my blue pen had been lodged inside of the leather-bound notebook. I opened it up and saw a brand new entry that hadn't been there the night before. I sat down at the desk, trying to make sense of this new entry, written in a different handwriting from the others. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was reading. I read, in similar meticulous detail, how I had gone to a house up in the mountains and killed a young couple on their honeymoon. I read about how I'd killed the husband and that I had taken the wife's body back with me. I immediately jumped to my feet and ran to my computer, Googling the address furiously. Had I written this in some kind of murder and alcohol-induced sleepwalking? The address was real. It was a house just a half hour away, and there were no news articles about any murders in the area. My breathing continued to quicken as I stared at the house. The descriptions from the notebook matched it perfectly. It wasn't necessarily my handwriting, but there's no doubt it was different from the other entries, and it had been written with my pen. I Googled the nearest payphone, marked the location, and drove there. I dialed 911 with a gloved hand. 911, what's your emergency? A voice on the other end asked. Can you send someone over to a house for me? I'm concerned that something bad may have happened. Sir, what do you... I cut her off, instead passing the address. Did you get that? I asked. She said. I read the address again, then hung up. I drove back to my house, thinking hard the entire way. God, I needed a drink. My garage door opened up and I drove inside. It was only then that I noticed the axe on the ground. I closed the garage door and rounded my car. An unfamiliar axe lay on the ground beside the door to my house. I knelt down and picked it up to inspect it. The metal head was crusted with a layer of blood and hair. I stumbled back, holding my hand to my mouth. When no monster leapt from the darkness, I dropped the axe to the floor and walked inside to open another bottle. I spent the next hour constantly refreshing the news and praying for what must have been the first time in years. Please, I begged. Please let this be some big misunderstanding. Please. It only took 3 hours before the double homicide was front page news. I was already in an alcohol-fueled haze at that point. Every single detail was correct. Husband dead, wife missing. I realized then that I hadn't looked around my house. The wife's body was somewhere after all. Wouldn't she be in the house of her killer? The notebook had been silent on her final location. I spent the next hour looking through my house for places where I may have stashed her body, but came up short. A strange, bizarre revulsion to the notebook came over me. It had caused this. I wasn't sure how, but I knew that if I'd never picked it up, I wouldn't have had that axe in my garage, nor a conscience so weighted down by... No, that wasn't possible. I had to get rid of it. I briefly considered burning the notebook, but rejected the idea. No. Something told me that the book belonged back in the apartment where I found it. I drank a shot of espresso to sober up, then started walking. The apartment was just a few blocks away, and I figured I'd already killed enough people for one day. The night was cold, but I barely felt the chill through the haze of guilt, confusion, and fear. I reached the killer's apartment 20 minutes later. One of the windows on the ground floor was unlocked, which allowed me to slide inside. I closed it behind me and looked around at the apartment. The other killer had turned himself in, hadn't he? He'd had a conscience. My mouth turned down into a snarl. It wasn't my fault, even if I did do it. It was the damn notebook. I pulled it out and threw it onto the ground. After a moment of hesitation, I scooped it back up and walked up the dark stairs to the master bedroom. It was the same as I'd left it the day before, though the vent looked off. Maybe the landlord had noticed I'd messed with it. No matter. I knelt down and pulled hard on the vent, earning a cut on my thumb as the metal slid free. I reached down and grabbed the notebook, then extended my arm into the darkness where I hit something soft and wet. I flipped on my phone's light and saw the body of a woman lying inside, covered in enough blood to leave the scent of iron in the air. I stumbled back, trying to make sense of it. Surely I hadn't killed this woman, then driven to the house, right? Then my thought from earlier returned to me. The woman's body was almost certainly on the killer's property. The front door of the apartment below me opened with a crash. I spun and backed up, still on my hands and knees as the sound of slow, steady footsteps climbed up the stairs. The bedroom door opened and the light flicked on. The landlord I'd met the other day stood in the doorway holding an axe covered in still wet blood. "Well, I'm sad to say you weren't at home this time," he said, gripping the head of the axe with a beefy fist. "You're probably wondering what the hell's going on. Am I right?" He pointed the handle of the axe towards me. "Am I right?" I nodded slowly, my mind racing. He hefted the axe in his hands. "There's just something about convincing other people that they're killers. Not even the light leaving someone's eyes gives me the rush I felt when that poor sap turned himself in. Sorry, liar. You just happened to be the next to pick up the book. But you made it easy. You even gave me your name. Looks like I'll have to leave that notebook out for someone else to find. Maybe a detective will wake up to find he's killed his wife. What do you think?" He took a step into the room. I jumped to my feet and ran for the bathroom. I knew from my time there earlier that it had a window. I'd only made it a few feet before the axe slammed into the back of my left arm. I ignored the pain and leapt at the window, crossed my arms into an X, and crashed through the glass. The fall was just long enough for me to reflect on my poor decisions before I hit the ground. A dozen things inside me broke with the impact, but that wasn't what worried me. What worried me was that I'd hear heavy footsteps again. But I didn't hear footsteps. I heard a cry of surprise. A young couple ran over to me. "Are you okay?" the man shouted. The last thing I heard before losing consciousness was the wife calling the police. I'll skip over my stay in the hospital, the police's fruitless search for the landlord, and my panic attacks. They still haven't found him, and I don't think I'll be able to sleep until they do. I let the police take copies of the notebook, but I still own the original. And I'm not gonna lie to you, I still occasionally check the ending to make sure no new entries have shown up. In the fall of 2016, I moved into a home I got for a very reasonable price. I was newly single, so I wanted a place to myself. It had 3 bedrooms, a big bathroom, spacious kitchen, and a nice living room with a bay window. The basement was one big space with a laundry unit, so this was more than enough for me. The block was mostly abandoned houses with only 5 other families occupying the other properties. I only had one neighbor right beside my home. I wasn't a social bug at the time, so I never bothered to meet the neighbors. It seemed that my neighbor was also single and a female, slightly older than me. She was Hispanic, or at least seemed to be. On the 3rd day, she greeted me from her yard as I was taking out the trash. She said her name was Griselda and that she was house sitting for her sister, who was in Guerrero, Mexico with her 2 nieces, for the next few months. She didn't say much after that. Over the next week, I would constantly catch her watching me as I did my normal house routines, as well as yard work. She would look from her windows as I would be cooking or cleaning. I would usually just ignore it and close my shades. I'm not one to worry much, so it didn't bother me at first. When I would come and leave for work, she would always be on her porch in her wooden chair. I started to wonder if she even had a job. She never left her house, not even for groceries or to take out her garbage. She even wore the same clothes every day. Her house lights were never on. The only light that would be on was the basement, and that was only at night. No crime was committed, so I couldn't report this, so I just kept to myself. Around the second month, I became aware she was speaking what I believe was Latin on her porch as she watched me come and go for work. Strange things began to happen. Things in the house went mysteriously missing. Small random things like my comb, photos, and even an old kitchen knife. I would come home and a window would be slightly open, a light would be on, that I knew was off. The basement door would be unlocked. I would always keep it locked. Even my garbage cans would look like someone was looking through them. This began to concern me. One night I woke up to the sound of leaves rustling outside my bedroom window. I see her crouched down looking inside my basement and the light was on. I go to my porch to confront her before checking my basement. She was already on her porch. I told her to stay the fuck off my property. She gives me a dirty look, says something under her breath, and then spits in my direction. I storm inside and head for my basement. All the missing items were on the basement floor. What the fuck? I gather them and put them on the kitchen counter. I was very sleepy, so I chose to go back to sleep since I had a long work day ahead. The next night was not what I expected. As I left for work at 7 a.m., I noticed she wasn't on her porch this time. Thank goodness, she gets the point, I thought to myself. That night I woke up, I hear this woman. She's in my house. Her voice was coming from the basement. I get my baseball bat and head downstairs. Basement door is wide open and the light's on. She wasn't down there, but I found 3 rats that were gutted. Their insides were scattered around the basement. Suddenly I hear footsteps going up the stairs to the bedroom. I run up and find her naked, sitting at the foot of my bed. She had blood on her hands, arms, chest, and face. She killed those rats with her fucking teeth. She hissed at me and I slammed the door shut, locking her in. I called the police and they arrive in minutes. They informed me that her name was Ashley. They also discovered her sister and the 2 nieces in the basement of their home. Their bodies were propped on a couch. They were decomposing. A camera on a tripod was in front of them. She was taking photos with them and had a smile on each one. She stabbed them to death. The police stated that the photos went back as far as 3 months. The bodies slowly decomposing in each of them. I believe I was about to be your next victim. I still live here, but I'm more cautious about the people around me. I now know to report suspicious behavior when I see it. Stay safe, y'all.